Why does the Navitimer not get as much love as the Speedy or Submariner, arguably the two most iconic watches of all time? The Navi actually predates both of them. Its story is just as rich, pioneering, and crucial to the history of horology. Is it merely down to its often divisive, busy look? How come the focus is always on the Speedmaster or the Daytona? And why do I consider it one of the greatest chronographs of all time? Up there with the Hanhart 417 ES, my beloved Seiko Flighty, and naturally, the Omega Speedy too. Well, love or loathe the Navitimer, today I share 9 things all watch enthusiasts should know about this underrated icon. Okay, hi guys, and welcome to the show. And today, the wristwatch check is the subject matter at hand. And you'll probably notice it's on a different strap to the rest of the video. This is actually a special edition from NDC, you know, who make the famous parachute straps, with the Urban Gentry on the buckle and un piccolo bandiera italiana, for me, the Italian flag, of course. But in the rest of the video, it's on the Rios, amazing German-made aviation straps. I've talked about them endlessly on the channel. And the rest of the time, it's on the El Alamein I designed for Risk County Watch Club. All the links down below. So anyway, without further ado, let's get on with the rest of the video. The first and most obvious thing to learn about the Navitimer is the etymology of the name. The name Navitimer is a portmanteau of navigation and timer. Yes, painfully obvious and simple, but it is a stroke of genius as it perfectly encapsulates the core 2 functions of the watch that we will now discuss. Speaking of which, in a pre-digital world, pilots not only needed to keep time accurately and record time, but also make navigational computations quickly. Breitling were the first to introduce a sliding rule scale, first with the Navitimer's predecessor, the chronomat, in 1942. The Navitimer debuted in 1952 with an even more complex bezel, jointly developed with the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association, the AOPA. It features a logarithmic double-rotating slide rule scale, with which fuel consumption, rate of climb or descent, and the average speed can all be calculated easily. At a time when electronics were not as heavily dominating the cockpit like today, the Navitimer was greatly appreciated, especially by airplane pilots. It became officially recommended as the pilot's watch by the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association. Hence why you often see the AOPA logo rather than the Breitling winged logo on the dial of these early versions. Very sorry for the interruption, but I just want to make sure you clicked on that like button before we continue. Number 3, and nothing certifies a watch as iconic like space travel, right? But the Navitimer, and forgive the pun, goes one step further in that exploration of mankind's greatest frontier. Not only did the Navitimer beat the Speedmaster into space by a few months in 1962, it was also the first watch to be specially adapted for space exploration. The Mercury Atlas VII launched on May 24, 1962, and was the 4th crewed flight of Project Mercury. The spacecraft, named Aurora 7, was piloted by astronaut Scott Carpenter. He was the 6th human to fly into space. Carpenter was also the 2nd American, after John Glenn, to orbit the Earth, as well as being the 4th American in space. The watch he wore was the Navitimer Cosmonaut, which is my current Navitimer, albeit a contemporary incarnation of it. It was essentially the same as your typical 806 reference Navi of the time, but with 2 big differences. It was modified so the hour hand rotates the dial every 24 hours and not 12 hours, and features a corresponding 24-hour markings on the dial. So the reason is quite simple. In space, there's no day or night. So the necessity for knowing time in a 24-hour context immediately becomes more useful. I have to say, as a collector, I have no watch like this or ever have had a watch like this. It's very unique, and you certainly need to get used to it. But when you do, it kind of I don't know, makes you appreciate time in a whole new way. Carpenter, being a former US Navy test pilot, was already a big fan of the Navi. So much so, he personally requested Breitling to modify the Navitimer so it would be more suitable for astronauts. NASA at the time did not officially select a watch to be worn by its astronauts, but instead left it to the astronaut to choose their watch for their mission. This obviously changed shortly after, but the fact that Carpenter chose the Navitimer himself speaks volumes about the following and reverence it had, even so early in its history. Okay, and the fourth thing is something that undoubtedly gets forgotten all too often, and that is not necessarily about the design of the Navi, but about the brand Breitling itself, the contribution they made to the history of the chronograph. We very much take it for granted when we look at the pusher or dial layout of a chronograph watch. It was Breitling that created the modern chronograph wristwatch as we know it today. In 1915, Gaston Breitling, the son of Breitling's founder Leon Breitling, produced the first chronograph with a central seconds hand and a 30-minute counter. Then in 1923, Gaston developed the first chronograph pusher. Previously, the start and resetting was still done with the crown. He passed away in 1927, so then it was the turn of his son, Willy Breitling, to continue this amazing legacy of innovation. In 1934, he introduces the world's first chronograph with two pushers either side of the crown, which would then go on to be adopted by the entire industry and become the norm to this day. When you understand how significant this all is, combined with the Navi's own world firsts and how this is all in its DNA, you really start to appreciate it on a more profound level. Okay, at number 5, it's that Navitimers were oversized way before it even was a thing. In fact, I wonder if they started that trend. During the Navitimer's initial development, it was clear that in order to make the intricate scales more legible compared to its chronomat progenitor, a size increase was required. The first Navis and 806s were around 40mm in diameter, which today hardly seems massive at all, but in the 1950s was considerable. There was of course the gargantuan 55mm Fliegers the Germans used during the war, but those were intended to be worn over flight suits while wearing goggles. Watches simply didn't need to be that big anymore, especially in modern jet cockpits. I know I have been very vocal for my disdain for oversized watches, but when it comes to divers and pilot watches, there are always exceptions. The Navitimer is supposed to be big. It's one of the few times that it's even preferable. Today, the Navi is available from anywhere between 38mm to 46mm and beyond, decades before the oversized watch trend of the early 2000s was even a thing. Number 6, it's fame, or rather, people who famously wore the Navi, and most crucially, not because they were paid to, but on their own volition. We are not talking about official ambassadorships, so forget Travolta, Brad Pitt, and so on. There is, however, two that come to mind above all others. Firstly is unequivocally one of the most influential and acclaimed musicians in the history of jazz and 20th century music. We are, of course, talking about Miles Davis, whose 5-decade-long career kept him at the forefront of many major stylistic developments in jazz. But aside from his musical genius, early in his career, before his more flamboyant style of dressing in the 70s, the then super dapper Davis could often be seen wearing an 806 Navitimer while performing. Listening to his most accomplished early work, I can't get the image out of my mind. The Navi on his wrist, so close to his trumpet as he gifted us with his supreme talent and monumental works of musical art. I mean, we're really talking ultimate sprezzatura here. The fact that he chose to wear such a dedicated, tooltastic pilot's instrument watch with such smart sartorial choices was kind of like his music, well ahead of its time. The second notable wearer is Hollywood legend Kurt Russell. Russell is a keen pilot and owns several planes himself, so the motivation behind his choice is obvious. But what I admire about him is his impressive body of work, especially his many collaborations with film director John Carpenter. It is rare that an actor plays so many lovable anti-hero characters, like Snake Plissken in Escape from New York, or R.J. MacReady in The Thing, Jack Burton in Big Trouble in Little China, and so on.
I count to 3. I open that door. We move out.
Everybody got that?
Ready? Follow the leader. 1, 2, 3. We may be trapped.
But aside from classic movies, he can still hold his own in the purest of cheesy schlock, or for that matter, underrated art house horror gems like the amazing Bone Tomahawk. Fundamentally, what Davis and Russell have, that so many artists today really lack, is a genuine, indefinable, charismatic coolness. And it certainly rubs off on the Navitimer.
Good evening. Civilized towns. You look a man direct in the face when you talk to him.
As we are on the subject of cinematic stardom, let's not forget it was also in the Bond movie Thunderball in 1965. While not an actual Bond watch per se, like the modded Breitling Top Time Sean Connery wore in the movie, the Navitimer 806 was used as a plot device and naturally belonged to a character that was a pilot. Okay, number 7 is a few interesting facts from the rather dark and bizarre period of Breitling's demise following the quartz crisis. Like so many other Swiss brands during the 1970s, it was a time of turmoil and they struggled to remain relevant after the Japanese decimated the industry with their ultra-affordable and super-accurate quartz technology. If you ever wondered why the German watchmaker Sinn produces an almost identical Navi with their 903, that is because it essentially is. Breitling started selling off the rights to the Navi's design, even their entire stock of parts, to Helmut Sinn, Sinn's founder, for a much-needed injection of cash. The first 903s were almost entirely Breitling parts, with a simple brand name change on the dial. Later, Sinn, with that typical Germanic ruthless efficiency, vastly improved it substantially. They gave it a second crown to control the bezel and superior gaskets, all upgraded the water resistance, which, let's face it, has been the Navi's Achilles heel since the very start. Scott Carpenter's Navitimer famously suffered water damage during his return to Earth when Aurora 7 splashed down northeast of Puerto Rico. Incidentally, he was rescued by helicopters of the USS Intrepid no less, before it was decommissioned and converted to the Awesome Museum in New York City. The Sinn 903 is not the only oddball Navitimer. Breitling released several quartz versions, like the Jupiter. There was also an Anidigi with the Pluton, and perhaps most peculiar of all, the entirely digital LED Navitimer. It's no surprise that sales of all of these versions were poor, and Breitling soon were forced to sell the brand in 1978 to Ernst Schneider. An avid pilot and owner of Sicura, a manufacturer of affordable watches, he then relocated Breitling to Gretchen in 1982, where the brand started a second life, focusing more as being a luxury Swiss watchmaker. This ties in very nicely with number 8, and that is the evolution of the movements the Navitimer has had over the years. Before 1978, as a family business, the Navi was traditionally powered by the manual wound, column wheel equipped Venus 178. There were a few during the 1950s with the Valjoux 72, the same movement that can be found in vintage Rolex Daytonas and subsequently are among the most desired and collectible. During the 1960s, they started using the Valjoux 7740, a manually wound cam-operated movement that allowed the Navi to feature a date complication. Then in 1969, the Swiss and Japanese raced to be the first with an automatic mechanical chronograph. The Caliber 11 was introduced in collaboration with Heuer, using a Buren movement as a base. The result was unusual, as the crown had to be shifted to the left side. The dial layout was also changed from tri-compacts to bi-compacts with a date at 6 o'clock. But still slender, this comically oversized Navi, reference 1806, was nicknamed the Fried Egg and was the largest yet, at a staggering 48mm in diameter. After being sold off, the brand had a comeback in the 1990s, especially as there was a resurgence in demand for mechanical watches. Around that time, they switched to the Valjoux 7750, which you've seen in my previous Navitimer with the blue dial. But in 1999, they made every single movement, quartz, mechanical, across the board, all COSC certified as standard. Eventually, this inevitably led Breitling to come full circle with a return to chronograph making glory. In 2009, the first completely in-house column wheel based automatic caliber, the B01, was introduced. And just in time, as a few years later, the Navitimer celebrated its 60th anniversary in 2012. My own Cosmonaut is one of the few with a Le Manu caliber 1873 from the 1990s. As it's a manual wind, and without a date, it's a smidgen thinner and thus wears smaller than my typically chunky Valjoux 7750 based Navi I previously owned. My final point at number 9 is that compared to, yes, I'm looking at you, Submariner and Speedmaster, Navitimers in terms of prices have remained the most realistic. Okay, yeah, they're still very expensive, but they are more attainable than the other heavyweight icons. Out of these top 3 icons, the Navi can be purchased for well under $5,000, with some of the less desired quartz variations for considerably less. The sweet spot consistently for the last 10 years has been the Japanese market. In fact, that is where I purchased mine from, via a seller based in Japan on eBay. In conclusion, for me, it remains one of those watches I will always have in my collection. I've owned a vintage 806 reference of Navi, the quintessential non-Cosmonaut version in stunning blue, and now this one. But no matter which one, there is always something so mesmeric, ineffable, and alluring about the dial with all those beautifully laid out details. It's not only a mathematical instrument, it's a work of art and perhaps one of my favorite dials ever created. Will I ever use all these complications? Maybe never, but that is not the point. It remains pure class, because I understand its meaning, the intention behind the design, but most importantly, the significance. Okay, so that's it. Now, what do you think of the Navitimer? Overrated, underrated? What do you love or loathe about them? Which is your favorite model? Please do share that, especially in the comments. I'd love to hear from any Navitimer fans. Any interesting facts I may have missed out, do share that as well. Thank you so much for watching. Please don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed it, found it useful. And as always, I will catch you in the next one. Okay, ciao.